mounted his horse, but remained in the battery, trying to distinguish by the smoke the cannon that had sent the projectile. His eyes wandered over the whole landscape. All that he could make out was, that the till now motionless masses of the French were beginning to stir, and that there really was a battery at the left. The smoke above it had not yet dispersed. 2 French riders, apparently aides, were spurring down the hill. At the foot of the hill, a small, but clearly distinguishable column of the enemy were moving, evidently for the purpose of strengthening the lines. The smoke of the first gun had not blown away when another puff arose, followed by the report. The action had begun. Prince Andrei turned his horse and galloped back to Grund to find Prince Bagration. Behind him he heard the cannonade, growing more frequent and louder. It was plain that our side had begun to reply. Below, in the space where the envoys had met, musket shots were heard. Lemarot, with Bonaparte's angry letter, had just dashed up to Murat, and Murat, ashamed of himself and anxious to retrieve his blunder, had immediately begun to move his army against the centre, and at the same time around both flanks, hoping before night and the arrival of the Emperor to demolish the insignificant division that opposed him. "It has begun. Here it is," said Prince Andrei to himself, feeling his heart beat more violently. "But where? How shall I find my Toulon?" Riding among the companies which had been eating their kasha gruel and drinking vodka only a quarter of an hour before, he everywhere found the soldiers hastily moving about, getting into line and examining their guns. On all faces there was the same feeling of expectancy which he had in his heart. The face of every soldier seemed to say, "It has begun. Here it is. How terrible! How glorious!" Before he reached the unfinished earthworks, he saw in the twilight of the gloomy autumn day some horsemen riding toward him. The foremost, in a felt burka and lamb's wool cap, rode a white horse. This was Prince Bagration. Prince Andrei stopped and waited for them. Prince Bagration reined in his horse and, recognizing Prince Andrei, nodded to him. He kept his eyes straight ahead all the time, while Prince Andrei was reporting to him what he had seen. The thought, "It has begun, here it is," could also be read on Bagration's strong, brown face with the half-closed, dull eyes that seemed to show the lack of sleep. Prince Andrei, with uneasy curiosity, looked into his impassive face and tried to read whether he had any thoughts or feelings, and if so, what the thoughts and feelings of this man were at this moment. Is there anything remarkable behind that impassive face? Prince Bagration nodded his head in approval of what Prince Andrei reported and said, "Good," as though all that had taken place and all that he heard was exactly what he had already anticipated. Prince Andrei, all out of breath from his swift gallop, spoke hurriedly. Prince Bagration pronounced his words with his Eastern accent and with especial deliberation, as though to give the impression that there was no haste. However, he put his horse to the trot in the direction of Tushin's battery. Prince Andrei and his suite followed him. His suite consisted of an attaché, of Zherkov, the prince's personal adjutant, an orderly, the staff officer of the day on a handsome English cob, and a civil chinovnik serving as auditor, who, out of curiosity, had asked permission to come out to the battle. The auditor, a fat man with a fat face, with a naive smile of delight, glanced around, as he jolted on his horse, presenting a strange figure, his camelot cloak on a pack-saddle, among the hussars, Cossacks, and adjutants. "This man here wanted to see a battle," said Zherkov to Bolkonsky, pointing to the auditor. "Why, he's got a pain in the pit of his stomach already." "Come now, that'll do," exclaimed the auditor, with a radiant, naive, and at the same time shrewd smile, as though he enjoyed being made the butt of Zherkov's jokes, and as though he purposely made himself out to be duller than he really was. "Très drôle, mon Monsieur Prince," said the staff officer of the day. He remembered that in French there was some peculiar way of speaking the title of prince, but he could not get it quite right. By this time they had all reached Tushin's battery. A cannon-ball fell a short distance in front of them. "What was that fell?" asked the auditor, with his naive smile. "French pancakes," replied Zherkov. "Such things kill, I suppose," mused the auditor. "How shocking!" And it was evident that he took great delight in witnessing the whole scene. The words were hardly out of his mouth, when again unexpectedly came the same terrible whistle, interrupted suddenly by striking into something alive, and swish, 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 a Cossack, riding only a few steps behind and at the right, plunged off his horse and to the ground. Zherkov and the staff officer of the day crouched down in their saddles and drew their horses to one side. The auditor reined up near the Cossack and looked at him with eager curiosity. The Cossack was dead. The horse was still struggling. Prince Bagration, blinking his eyes, glanced around, and seeing the cause of the confusion, turned his head again indifferently, as much as to say, "It isn't worth while to bother with trifles." He reined in his horse with the skill of a good rider, bent over a trifle, and adjusted his sword, which had got entangled in his burqa. The sword was an old one, unlike those worn at the present time. Prince Andrei remembered having heard it said that Suvorov had given his sword to Bagration in Italy, and this recollection was peculiarly agreeable to him at this time. They reached the very same battery where Bolkonsky had been when he made his reconnaissance of the battlefield. "Whose company?" asked Prince Bagration of the gunner who was standing by the caissons. He asked "whose company," but his question seemed really to imply, "Aren't you all frightened, you men here?" And the gunner understood it so. "Captain Tushin's, your Excellency," cried the freckled, red-haired gunner, in a jocund voice, saluting. "So," exclaimed Bagration, absent-mindedly, as he passed by the limbers toward the last gun. Just as he reached it, this cannon rang out, with a report that deafened Bagration and his suite, and in the smoke that spread round could be seen the gunners, seizing the cannon and slowly bringing it back to its first place. Gunner number 1, a huge soldier with broad shoulders, holding the sponge, leaped back with a long stride to the wheel, and number 2, with trembling hand, forced the charge down the muzzle. A little round-shouldered man, the officer Tushin, stumbled over the tail of the carriage, hastened forward, without heeding the general, and gazed into the distance from under his small hand. "Raise it 2 lines more. There, that'll do," he cried in his little thin voice, to which he tried to impart a vigor ill-suiting his nature. "Number 2, he whined. "Let 'em have it, Medvedev." Bagration beckoned to the officer, and Tushin, with an awkward and timid gesture, absolutely unlike those used by military men, and more like a priest when giving a blessing, raised 3 fingers to his visor and went to the general. Although it had been intended for Tushin's field pieces to sweep the valley, he had begun to send red-hot balls at the village of Schöngraben, in front of which heavy masses of the French could be seen concentrating. No one had directed Tushin where and how to fire, and so, having consulted with his sergeant, Zakrachenko, in whom he had great confidence, he decided that it would be a good plan to set the village on fire. "Good," said Bagration, in reply to the officer's scheme, and then began to scan the field of battle before him, and seemed to be lost in thought. On the right, in the foreground, the French were advancing. Below the height on which the Kiev regiment was stationed, in the ravine through which flowed the brook, could be heard the soul-stirring roll and rattle of musketry, and just at the right, the attaché pointed out to the prince the column of the French trying to outflank our wing. At the left the horizon ended in dense forest. Prince Bagration ordered 2 battalions from the center to strengthen the right wing. The attaché ventured to remark to the prince that if these battalions were withdrawn, the artillery would be uncovered. Prince Bagration turned to the attaché and without replying looked at him through his lifeless eyes. It seemed to Prince Andrei that the attaché's criticism was correct, and that in fact no reply could be made to it. But at this instant an adjutant came galloping up from the regimental commander who was in the valley, with the report that overwhelming masses of the French were marching down upon them, and that his regiment was demoralized and was falling back upon the Kiev Grenadiers. Prince Bagration inclined his head in token of assent and approval. He walked slowly towards the right, and then sent the adjutant to order the dragoons to charge the French. But after the adjutant had been gone half an hour with this order, he returned with a report that the commander of the dragoon regiment had retired to the other side of the ravine so as to escape the destructive fire brought to bear upon him and to avoid useless loss of life, and therefore he had dispatched sharpshooters into the woods. "Good," said Bagration. Just as he was leaving the battery, at the left also, the reports of rifles in the forest began to be heard, and as it was too far for him to reach the left wing in time, Prince Bagration sent Zherkov thither to tell the old general, the very one who had exhibited his regiment before Kutuzov at Braunau, to retreat as soon as possible to the other side of the ravine, since, probably, the right wing would not be strong enough to withstand the enemy any length of time. Tushin and the battalion covering him were quite forgotten. Prince Andrei listened attentively to Prince Bagration's conversation with his subordinates, and to the orders that he issued, and to this amazement discovered that in reality he did not give any orders at all, but that the prince only tried to give the impression that all that was done by his various officers, either through necessity, chance, or volition, was done if not exactly by his orders, at all events in accordance with his design. Prince Andrei noticed that owing to the tact displayed by Prince Bagration, in spite of the fortuitousness of events and their absolute independence of the general's will, his presence was of great importance. The subordinates, with distracted faces, who kept galloping up to the prince, instantly became calm. Soldiers and officers received him with enthusiasm, and were animated by his presence, and evidently took pride in displaying their courage. End of chapter 17.